Please welcome to the stage Louise Dubé, CEO of iCivics.
Welcome to Philadelphia, the heart of all things civics, where we started 250 years ago. Thank you so much for being with us. This is the 4th National Forum of Civic Learning Week, and this year we supersized it. We doubled the size and doubled the length. Not to make your life difficult, and I know I sound like an infomercial, but anyway, we did it because we wanted to make more space for additional educator voice and student voice. You're going to see a lot of students joining us tomorrow morning. That is how you build a movement, by tapping into those who are closest to the work on the ground. So thank you for being with us. Before I go too far, I want to shout out the Carnegie Corporation of New York. I know some of you are in here today. They have been the stalwart supporter of the civic learning field for decades. If they had not invested in the civic mission of schools all the way back, we would not be where we are today. So thank you for your contribution to Carnegie. And how did we supersize it? Well, with a whole lot more funding from our sponsors. I want to thank our sponsors today. Oh, I'm supposed to do that. Yeah, there you go. I want to shout out to our lead sponsor, the Bezos Family Foundation, without whom we could not do this work. Thank you for all of our sponsors, many of whom are in this room today. So all of those. Now, if you supersize something, you got to have more content. Who did this content? I want to honor those who contributed a whole lot of hours to create a great program for you, and that would be the steering committee. If you are part of our steering committee, please stand to be honored today. Of course, Jane is going to stand up. Thank you so much to all of you. If you're part of the host committee in Philadelphia, please stand up and be recognized. Thank you so much, Adrian. If you're part of the education committee who helped us gather so many wonderful educators, please stand up. You guys are awesome. Thank you so much for doing all of that. So, the last but certainly not least, this community is built from a 450-member organizations that have joined as part of the Civics Now Coalition. It is an incredibly diverse coalition, probably one of the most diverse across the country. If you are a member of the Civics Now Coalition, please stand up and be recognized. Thank you so much for everything you do. Thank you, thank you. We may be small, but we are mighty when we act together. I talked to you about adding more student and educator voice. iCivics was and is by and for educators. 130,000 and then some of you come to iCivics to get resources every year and learn. About a couple months ago, we sent you a survey to ask you what it's like to teach civics right now in this country. And about 2,200 of you answered the call. And they paint a picture about how difficult it is to teach civics. About 35% of you reported changing or removing lessons because of the climate in their school or community. Almost 60% worried about experiencing backlash. Almost 20% of you decided that maybe they need to leave the profession. 53% said even teaching basic civic concepts are difficult. AI is not at all helping. It's only adding to the tension and anxiety about what is going to happen. And yet, all of you believe that civics is the backbone of our constitutional democracy. All of you are here because you believe in this work. And overwhelmingly, all of you believe that you should teach civics in a way that fosters pluralistic, diverse viewpoints, and that students need to make up their own minds. And it has to be both anchored in a diversity of point of view, but also in primary sources. Speaking of primary sources, how about the Declaration of Independence as a primary source? So if you have a minute, the Bill of Rights Institute, some of you are in the audience today, NI Civics, began a project as a gift to the nation, which is to have stories directly from the classroom about what you're doing with your students to celebrate the Declaration. So if you have a second, take a picture of that QR code and just go in and tell us what that story is, and you actually could win prizes. There's actual cash on the line here. Importantly, that we would love for you to do that. Before I go there, I want to say that when you're in a classroom, you often feel alone. You feel like you're disconnected, that there are not other people who feel the same way you do. When you're here, you are part of this movement. You heard in the video that there is a civic renewal, or a renewal of civic education in this country. I feel it every day. I see it here, I see it in classrooms, I see it with funders, I see it in students, and I want to tell you that you are not alone, that we are in this together. That you will see that during this conference. It's a pluralistic conference. You will see diverse points of view. There may be things you hear that you will not agree with, and there will things you hear that you will agree with. That is the point of this conference. Let's all be tolerant of everybody's views and come out as a more informed community and a more informed nation. I hope that you have been able to attend some of the ancillary events that were put on by our great partners. It was fantastic last night. I know I was at the Eastern State. That was a great event. And mostly, I hope that you can join us tonight for our reception that is in partnership with the American Academy of Arts and Sciences. Mayor Sherelle Parker will be giving an address, and it'll be a whole lot of fun. I hope you can join it. And so thank you again for being here. And with that, I am going to introduce my friend and partner in all things civics, Professor Danielle Allen, leader of the Democratic Knowledge Project, and also the co-host of this year's forum. Thank you, Danielle.
Good morning, friends. It is so good to see you. I'll thank you for that shout back. I'll give you a chance to do a shout back. Good morning, friends. It is so wonderful to see you all here, and I am so grateful to my dear friend Louise for kicking us off so beautifully. This is the 250th. I will beg to differ with the governor, however, about which state precisely initiated the revolution. Thank you, Massachusetts. Nonetheless, of course, we did it together, and that is also why we are here. It's the occasion of a birthday. That's an occasion for celebration, also for reflection. These are difficult times. We all feel the stress and anxiety of them. The fact that you have made time to come together in this way is the most important gift any of us can give to a project of renewal for our country. This is the beginning of a decade-long period for reflection on our founding principles and purpose. This is, of course, the 250th celebration of the Declaration of Independence, but that will just take us on a journey to celebrating the 250th anniversary of the Constitution. There will be people in this room who have vivid memories of the tall ships in 1976 celebrating the bicentennial. I have vivid memories of the celebrations of the constitutional bicentennial. I remember poring over a brochure in which, for whatever reason, Benjamin Franklin was the visage that made the biggest impression on me as a young teenager. And that, for me, was the moment where my connection to our history crystallized. Jefferson famously said that every 20 years there needed to be a rebellion. He said in chilling words that the tree of liberty must be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots. I'm here to say that Jefferson was wrong about that. That what we do every 20 years is refresh the tree of liberty by reminding ourselves of our history, by re-engaging with the question of how we introduce new generations to that history, by reinvigorating the work of civic learning. This community is refreshing the tree of liberty, and for that we are profoundly grateful. We are making progress. Today, tomorrow, this week is an occasion to offer a birthday present to the nation. In 2016, only 1 in 4 Americans could name the 3 branches of government. Last year, 7 in 10 could. A decade ago, we were on the verge of becoming a nation that had forgotten how to explain itself to its own children. Now, pocket constitutions abound. Something happened in between. In 2018, Civics Now was founded. In 2021, the EAD roadmap launched. As you heard, 48 states now have coalitions advancing civic learning infrastructure in their states. 39 states have schools and community learning partners like museums and historical societies that are doing EAD-aligned curricular or program pilot work. By a conservative count, thousands of teachers and hundreds of thousands of students are already engaged in EAD-aligned civic learning. Those educators, those students are focused on the knowledge, skills, and civic dispositions and virtues that can keep a constitutional democracy sound. That work is anchored by the values of reflective patriotism and pluralism. We build a love of country while also supporting clear-eyed review of our strengths and weaknesses so that we can continuously improve. We recognize the beauty of what we all bring to our shared table from so many different backgrounds and perspectives, faiths, points of view, and we learn how to respect, relate, and cooperate in the context of that pluralism. We tell our plural story, the stories of so many families on different journeys into this American experience. We knit them together into a shared whole. As Louise said, we're here at the Civic Learning National Forum because of our shared commitment to high-quality civic learning. We all care deeply about this and deeply about many aspects of our common world. We are diverse often in the conclusions that we come to, and so that positive commitment to democracy often leads us to disagree and debate. That is a feature, not a bug. And over the course of this forum, we will hear a variety of views. Every speaker is entitled to communicate their message. All members are entitled to hear that message. So for the sake of our work on pluralism, we ask the audience not to make sustained or repeated noise in a way that would interrupt the communication between speakers and listeners. I also will say we want to establish the norm. If there are disruptions, just for your awareness, people will be asked to leave and people will be escorted from the premises. But we know this is a community committed to pluralism, so we do not expect that to occur, but nonetheless want you to be aware of our policies and commitments. Tomorrow morning we'll do special welcomes for all the local educators who are joining us. But I also want to say, as a part of our birthday present to the nation, that today and tomorrow we have 250 educators and students to celebrate the 250th anniversary of the nation joining us. It is thrilling to have educators and students in the room with us. If we could give them a round. So for now, my special introduction is of our keynote speaker. And before I introduce her, I want to also point to the 2 mics in the front of the room. After Professor Lepore concludes her remarks, you are welcome to queue up by those mics, and she will take questions from the audience. Professor Lepore is the David Woods Kemper 41 Professor of American History at Harvard University and Professor of Law at Harvard Law School. She is also a staff writer at The New Yorker. Her many books include books I know you all know. For example, These Truths, A History of the United States, an international bestseller and named one of Time Magazine's top 10 nonfiction books of the decade. This year, Professor Lepore has published We the People, A History of the U.S. Constitution. If you haven't seen it yet, I encourage you to pick it up. It will open up for you the possibility of revisability of the Constitution. It's a fascinating read, told, as Professor Lepore always does, with all the brilliance of vivid storytelling for which she's so well known. Professor Lepore is also a dear colleague, a person of extraordinary judgment, and a patriot, committed profoundly to her undergraduates having the opportunity to understand the American tradition in a deep way. Also, she is committed to having them debate in her classroom. She's established a model for that on our campus. It's a pleasure to welcome her here today for her keynote remarks. Professor Lepore.
It's really such an honor to be in this room. Thanks, Louise, and thanks, Danielle. Thanks all of you for being here and for the work you do that is just of magnificent importance. My parents were both public school teachers, and they also belonged to opposing political parties. So my civics education largely consisted of dinner table arguments, followed by breakfast table arguments, reading the newspaper. So I really feel like it was a great gift of my parent teachers to inculcate the values of civics from the crib and beyond. So I am really delighted to be here and especially moved to be here in Philadelphia on this occasion of the 250th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence, which couldn't be a more perfect time for the kind of renewal that iCivics and the Democratic Knowledge Project are doing and the work that all of you are doing. So I hope that we all feel the wind is at our backs. I want to begin by telling you a story about apple pie. On the law books of Vermont is a very unusual little statute. I'd like to read it to you. An act relating to designating the state pie and the state fruit is hereby enacted by the General Assembly of the State of Vermont. The state pie shall be apple pie. When serving apple pie in Vermont, a good faith effort shall be made to meet one or more of the following conditions. A, with a glass of cold milk. B, with a slice of cheddar cheese weighing a minimum of a ½ ounce. C, with a large scoop of vanilla ice cream. Also, the state fruit shall be apple. Now, there are two kinds of people in this room. There are people who are thinking, doesn't the Vermont legislature have anything better to do? And then there are people who are thinking, my God, this is what good government looks like. Also, there are people who are now a little hungry. And to all of you, I say yes, yes, and yes. And also, this is what good civics looks like. This law came about in 1999 because an elementary school teacher was teaching a unit on how laws are made and decided to take her class of very little kids to the Vermont State House in Montpelier. This isn't them. This is, in fact, the kid governor of Vermont, who, by the way, is holding the first kid governor press conference with the kid press corps. Vermont has a very active civics program. But in 1999, some littler kids than these got in touch with a guy. Their teacher got in touch with a guy named Ed Paquin, who'd been elected to the legislature a few years before. Ed had been working in the building trades and had a terrible accident with a high voltage wire, left him in a wheelchair. He decided to run for the legislature, did a lot of work on disability rights. But he had this idea that if the kids in this classroom from Barre, Vermont were going to come all the way to Montpelier and tour the State House, they ought to actually not just learn, but do. And they might as well write a law and see if they could get it passed. So kids wrote the law, the apple pie law of Vermont. They wrote it, they stood in the old State House, and they testified in support of it. Some testified against it, offered different toppings that ought to be in the statute. And I tell you this story because I hope you will go to Vermont and order some apple pie. And I hope you will notice whether your server remembers to make a good faith effort to offer you a glass of milk or a slice of cheese or a scoop of ice cream, or ideally in greater compliance with the law, all three. But I'm also telling you this story because teaching civics matters in ways little and big, from elementary school through college and also through adulthood. And I want to actually talk a little bit today about citizenship as a kind of lifelong learning process, because I think it helps us to understand what the particular obligations are in K-12 instruction and so where we're at in a historical context in thinking about those obligations. And I think it can be hard to measure the importance and efficacy of civics education from childhood through adulthood. Obviously, that civics education matters is not a hot take in this room, but I want to talk about why and how civics matters. And I'd like to offer up some history in that regard. In my mind, thinking back to those breakfast table arguments with my parents, civics is in some ways less something that you study, that's something that you study how to do. You do that by participating in democratic society, by exercising your rights and your duties as a citizen. This requires understanding constitutional democracy, but it also requires, as you all know better than anyone, it requires gaining skills in belonging to and shaping a community, helping to craft, abide by, and enforce its rules, and building its capacity for conversation, determination, and action. So I like to picture these students going to that state house in Montpelier, Vermont. They learn in their classroom, they learn about how laws get made, and then they prepare for that field trip. And I picture them arguing about what kind of a law they want to propose, meeting with their legislator Ed Paquin, asking him questions, touring the State House, sitting in its funny, fancy seats, getting dressed up for the field trip. It's got everything that civics education requires. The study and doing and exercising of rights and duties, the study and exercising of community rules, of conversation, of determination and action, and it also has ice cream. But I sometimes think it's a little bit romantic, even, to call this civics education. Because the very act of being in a classroom, any good classroom, with a good teacher, any good teacher, inculcates the values that we associate with democratic citizenship. Because there are three elements to democratic citizenship: representation, participation, and deliberation. Aren't those the things kids are asked to do in school every day? Sit down in a room with a random group of people with whom they likely disagree about all kinds of things and agree about others, and figure out a way to learn together by participating and deliberating and learning, and sometimes delegating a few of them to undertake certain tasks in which they represent everyone else's interests. I think we give far too short a shrift to the very elemental way in which K-12 public education in this country is, and from the start of the common school movement in the 1830s, has always been a means of raising democratic citizens. It also used to be that there were many, many other civil society institutions that did this work exceptionally well. Raising democratic citizens, inculcating the habits of representation, participation, and deliberation. Those institutions included labor unions, temperance societies, YMCAs, chambers of commerce, chapters of the Urban League, the Farmers' Grange. All of those institutions are in decline. And frankly, I think it's important to note that K-12 public education is by some measures the only civil society institution that is really left standing, which is part of why there is so much pressure and urgency around the need for civics education today and for this very renewal that you are all a part of and the leaders of. And that is why K-12 education is so important to defend and to strengthen. One way to think about just how important K-12 education is now in inculcating the values of democratic citizenship is to think about practices that used to be commonplace but that are no longer, and that put some of that pressure on schools. It used to be that there was another very frequent way of learning and doing civics, and that was holding constitutional conventions. US states used to hold constitutional conventions all the time. Meetings in rooms like this of elected delegates who were elected to write or revise state constitutions, which were then sent back to voters for ratification. These conventions were widely reported in the newspaper, avidly followed by ordinary people. There was, in effect, a near unceasing constitutional argument going on all over the United States all the time. Remember, laws govern people, but constitutions govern government. So holding these conventions was a way of asking, really frequently, is this how we wish to live? Or ought we to amend our fundamental law? And if we need to change it, let's elect people to get together and argue about it, see what they come up with, and see if we like it. Since the nation's founding, Americans have held 250 state constitutional conventions. Between 1800 and 1865, only 6 years passed in which no state held one. Americans learned about constitutional democracy by writing and revising and ratifying or protesting state constitutions and by following that process in the newspaper. A convention is the provided machinery of peaceful revolution, said one US senator. The very act of assembling, of gatherings like these, the convention itself became the symbol, the visible enactment of the sovereignty of the people. As the Supreme Court of Indiana put it in 1855, a constitutional convention of eminent citizens is the substitute for the armed mob of other countries. Americans held other kinds of conventions too, not just state constitutional conventions, because these state constitutional conventions before the Civil War, they were for white men and for white men only. But all of the people excluded from these kinds of meetings held their own conventions in which they drafted, ratified, and amended their own constitutions and statements of purpose and principle and organized petition campaigns and proposed amendments to federal and state constitutions. Black men held what were called colored conventions, where they elected delegates in what can properly be considered extra-constitutional conventions. Between 1830 and 1861, black delegates met in 49 conventions in the states, 2 regional conventions, and 11 national conventions. Native nations held conventions too. Sometimes they adopted their own national constitutions, as the Cherokee did in 1827. Sometimes they nullified state laws. Sometimes they asserted their rights under their own interpretation of the US Constitution. Women held the first Women's Rights Convention, of course, in 1848, the year political revolutions spread across Europe. By 1860, women had held 19 essentially constitutional conventions, 10 of them national. For most of American history, these conventions operated as a dominant mechanism of constitutional reform, of constitutional expression, even of anti-constitutionalism. They were also means of asserting and protesting and arguing over constitutional democracy and democratic citizenship. The militant abolitionist John Brown held a convention that wrote a constitution. When the southern states seceded, they held conventions and wrote constitutions. Americans in these years invented the first nominating convention in 1831. They held constitutions again and again and again, and everyone knew what it meant to be the writer of your own constitution, to exercise your capacity for citizenship. Utopian societies, religious denominations, temperance associations held conventions. So did everyone from debtors in debtors' prison to squatters in a mining camp. And so did school children. The writing of constitutions, something that we inherit now in the kind of the early weeks of September when you devise classroom rules together, that was a very common mode of education, especially in the early grades across the 19th and 20th centuries. So we might ask ourselves, what happened to all those conventions? I think in many ways we can track the degree to which Americans in recent decades have lost trust in one another to do things like hold conventions. The last state to hold a full-dressed constitutional convention was Rhode Island, and that was in 1986. Many US states routinely ask voters, because this is required in their constitutions, if they want to hold a convention. But since 1986, every US state has said no. There are, of course, many other forms of civic education that take place for adults, that take place outside schools for lifelong experience of learning how to be a democratic citizen. And that tends to flare up when democracy is in crisis. So I want to talk for a minute about the 1930s and the discussion around what Americans should do, what school teachers should do, what other institutions, what civil society should do in the 1930s, which most commentators considered a crisis for American democracy. American democracy was weakened by political violence, hucksterism, racial injustice, unemployment, and the starvation and suffering of the Great Depression. We do not distrust the future of essential democracy, FDR said in his first inaugural address in 1933, telling Americans that the only thing they had to fear was fear itself. But there was more to be afraid of, including Americans' own declining faith in self-government. What does democracy mean? NBC Radio asked its listeners. Do we Negroes believe in democracy? W.E. Du Bois asked readers of his newspaper column. Could it happen here? Sinclair Lewis asked in 1935. Americans in the 1930s suffered and hungered and wondered. The future of democracy is topic number one in the animated discussion going on all over America. A contributor to the New York Times wrote in 1937. In legislatures, over the radio, at the luncheon table, in the drawing rooms, at meetings, and all kinds of groups of citizens everywhere, people are talking about the democratic way of life. In 1937, the New Republic, arguing that at no time since the rise of political democracy have its tenets been so seriously challenged as they are today, the magazine ran a series on the future of democracy. Do you think that political democracy is now on the wane? The editors asked each writer. The series' lead contributor, an Italian philosopher, took issue with the question. I call this kind of question meteorological, he grumbled. It is like asking, do you think it's going to rain today? Had I better take my umbrella? The trouble, he explained, is that political problems are not external forces beyond our control. They are forces within our control. We need solely to make up our own minds and to act, he said. In other words, don't ask whether you need an umbrella. Go outside and stop the rain. That's how I think about civics education. It's going outside and stopping the rain. Here are some of the sorts of people who went out and stopped the rain in the 1930s, who defended the idea of democracy by insisting on civic education. Above all, school teachers, but also businessmen and women, city councilors, librarians, poets, union organizers, artists, precinct workers, soldiers, civil rights activists, and investigative reporters. They knew and they were prepared to defend, and they defended democracy, even though they also knew that it risked attack. But above all, radio broadcasters were second only to school teachers in defending democracy in the 1930s. And I think that's a moment worth thinking about, because some of what radio broadcasters did in the 1930s lies, I think, behind much of the spirit that animates the renewed attention to civics education today. With radio, more than any other technology of communication before or since, Americans gained a sense of their shared suffering and their shared ideals. And they listened to one another. Above all, they listened to one another through this NBC broadcast called Town Meeting of the Air. How this thing worked started in 1935. There would be a huge debate held in a lecture hall on a college campus. This is one held in Columbia, at Columbia University. But the debate would be broadcast all over the country, and it was avidly followed, especially in schools. School teachers would play recordings, or they would gather their students to listen to the Town Meeting of the Air. And these were the kinds of topics that were debated by the Town Meeting of the Air over the course of the 1930s. There would be a presentation of evidence, then there would be a formal debate, and then the discussion would be opened to questions from the audience. In the lecture hall of more than 1,000 people, a lot of town public libraries held gatherings when the Town Meeting of the Air would be broadcast, and they had their own town debates following the broadcast of Town Meeting of the Air. They also really welcomed pluralism with the same spirit with which we are gathered here today, inviting onto that stage of panelists for the debate people with widely ranging political views considered offensive by many Americans and not offensive by other Americans. So one town meeting debate on the meaning of democracy, the panel included a communist, an exile from the Spanish Civil War, a conservative American political economist, and a Russian columnist. We didn't expect to settle anything, and therefore we succeeded, said one panelist at the end of the hour. We only learned that a democracy is a place where a Town Meeting of the Air can take place. That radio program was great. It was really instrumental. How successful it was is something we haven't even yet begun to measure. But what about doing that kind of thing in person in the 1930s? Here's where public schools came in the 1930s. The most ambitious plan to get Americans to show up in the same room and argue with one another came out of Des Moines, Iowa, where a one-eyed former bricklayer named John Studebaker was superintendent of the city's schools. He thought that it was kind of a shame that the public schools in his district were empty in the evening when Americans were really struggling to defend the idea of democracy. So he started holding essentially a town meeting of the air, but a town meeting of the school, in the schools all over Detroit. How he did, he did informal polls in the neighborhoods and had people in the neighborhoods pick the topics. This started in 1930. It was even before the town meeting of the air. And then he would bring together people in the neighborhood who might have strong views or might have areas of expertise on these topics. And they would use the schools to host these debates, these formal debates. Children would have their own versions of them during the school day, and then adults would continue the discussion in the evening. The meetings began at 7:45. There was a 15-minute news update, a 45-minute lecture, and followed by the debate. The idea was that everybody ought to be involved. Within the first 9 months of the program, 13,000 of the city's 76,000 adults had attended one forum. The program got so popular that FDR tried to adopt it into a federal forum program. It started out in 10 test sites in Orange County, California, all the way from there to Sedgwick County, Kansas, and Pulaski County, Arkansas. It included almost 500 forums in 43 states, involved 2.5 million Americans in its first year. The federal government paid for it, but everything else fell under local control. Ordinary people picked the topics. The schools volunteered their schools or town libraries. Sometimes they took place in settlement houses. Some businesses opened their doors to hold forums during the lunch hour to make it more possible for businessmen to attend. People who attended these meetings debated all sorts of things. Their efforts didn't always work. They weren't looking for agreement. They were trying to glue their civil society back together again. And doing that work, trying that kind of meeting, is better than talking about the weather, worrying about the rain, and waiting for someone to hand you an umbrella. We could talk for a long time about what happened to these kinds of initiatives, because I know you could tell me about initiatives just like this that are starting up or have recently started up all over the country. But I think it's worth noting, just here as someone coming from Harvard University, the degree to which higher education has actually abdicated its obligation to be doing this kind of work and leading in this kind of work. It used to be that a liberal arts education really was based on this model of learning about an issue and arguing about it as a way not only to gain knowledge about the issue, but to acquire the skill of living in a constitutional democracy. Harvard used to hold debates all the time. The entire function of higher education really was inculcating these values. One of the ways in which you can measure the falling off of this commitment is through the falling off of this kind of instruction, but also by the falling off of the commitment on the part of elite universities to public school teacher training. How many students at Harvard take jobs as K-12 public school teachers upon graduation? That number is effectively zero. More than half of the graduates at my university take jobs in finance, consulting, or tech. This is true across the higher education landscape. Yale dissolved its Department of Education in the 1950s. Duke phased out its teacher prep program a bit more recently. That decline is ongoing. Cornell closed its teacher training program and its education major in 2013. As recently as the 1970s, 1 in 5 college graduates majored in education. Today, it's less than 4%. So I think as we assess both the health of this initiative, it's worth being frank about who's not carrying enough of their own weight here. Makes me a little bit concerned about how we think about who's part of this initiative at this moment in time. So I want to end with one last little story, not about apple pie, but it does involve Vermont. A few years ago, I went to the University of Vermont to run a workshop for teachers, a little bit about how to teach constitutional argument. And we undertook an experiment that was also designed to have school teachers think a little bit about how to bring other elements of the curriculum into a civics classroom, including biology and ecology and scientific inquiry. And we devised an exercise in which I divided the teachers in a room like this into delegations, And the delegations involved both human entities and non-human entities. There are parts of the world where non-human entities do have representation in Congress or have rights, have constitutional rights. It's actually interesting legal movement around the world. But we spent a lot of time thinking about what it meant to represent the wetlands or the interests of the wetlands, what it meant to represent the interests of home builders, to think a little bit more creatively about representation, deliberation, and participation. And the point of the exercise was to have each delegation come up with a position on two possible laws. One was about to build a data center on Lake Champlain, and one was to rewild the rivers, which is a very hot button issue in Vermont politics these days. The school teachers made posters. They thought about what their delegation possibly could want legislatively or constitutionally. They participated, they deliberated, they imagined an utterly different system of laws, one where nature has rights, something that's entirely outside of our system, but it was a way to really cultivate creativity as a civic skill, to cultivate your imagination, the imagination of your students about the realm of the possible. In doing that, they pictured a future, a different future, and that I think ultimately is what this work is for, picturing a different future. It wasn't apple pie, but for that afternoon, the rain stopped. Thanks very much.
Thank you so much, Jill. That was just wonderful. I could go on about the concrete examples you gave, but the mics are ready, and I know people in the room have questions, so I'll leave it to you to call.
Okay.
Just please say your name and where you're from before you ask your question so we can see who's in the room.
Hi, Professor Lepore.
Hi.
Talk. The mic is working.
It should be on if you just hold it close to your mouth.
Does this work?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Harry. I work with a nonprofit called Project Pericles, consortium of liberal arts colleges trying to address this issue. Colleges abdicating their role and students going on to do beyond public civic engagement. And I'm so curious to hear what you think about how here over the past 20, 30, 40 years, I'm not going to ask you to predict in the future or make prescriptions, but do you think there's something with tenure and review policies that have played a role in this, the bureaucratization of higher education? How did we get to this point? Because it seems like it's not just student interest, this seems like a trend across higher education. And what are the sort of fundamental structures that have led us to get to colleges funneling students to do consulting and finance? Nothing wrong against that, but it seems like there's more potential.
I honestly, like, the history of this is an enormously complicated question. I mean, there are some forces we might think about. I think actually just in terms of the last decades, a huge number of people, men who went and women who got their education on the GI Bill went into teaching, right? There was a huge class booster, but my dad went to college on the GI Bill after the Second World War. It's totally obvious to him that he was going to dedicate himself to public education. He was an Italian immigrant. He wanted to give back. There was a sense of civic duty that was associated with that moment in time and with that generation. There are a whole bunch of other factors that have to do with regional state universities becoming teacher training schools and elite institutions being very happy to sort of offload that public obligation to public institutions, especially private elite universities. The funding structure of higher education really changed. I mean, they're just kind of, and I'm not an expert on this, so I don't want to give an uninformed answer. Do you have a...
That was a great answer, Jill. So I think, questions are queuing up, so let's go ahead and jump over here.
All right, let's see if this works. Hi, my name is Shannon. I teach students in nearby Allentown, Pennsylvania. So you spoke a lot about decreasing sense of self-efficacy amongst individuals, that we can self-govern, and 40 years of declining to convene constitutional conventions as a symptom of that. And I'm wondering if you see an impact of a rising public discourse around originalism and this idea that perhaps we the people today are not created equal to we the people of the 18th century, and that's why we should sit down and not be as active speaking up for what we want it to look like today.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question, and it's a really rich one. I mean, I think that just empirically it is the case that for the middle decades of the 20th century, liberals really opposed constitutional conventions and went to the courts for constitutional change. And conservatives were arguing for a constitutional convention to turn back some constitutional decisions of the courts. We're now in an era where that's flipped because the court is conservative rather than liberal. So there's that whole history there. I think what I'm talking about when we think about not convening, I think that's really, it's not a partisan issue in any way. It's really a trust issue. I sometimes say to people, if for some reason we had decided, so the last time the US Constitution was meaningfully amended was 1971. If in 1971 we had decided for some reason to abolish trial by jury for criminal trials, say, we were like, oh, we have like polygraphs that can tell if people are guilty or innocent. We'll just do this by machine. Like the way now there's people saying we should just do criminal procedure by AI. Do you think we could bring back trial by jury in 2026? Like, do people trust one another to put the fate, like if your child was accused of a crime, a capital crime, would you trust 12 random Americans to decide your child's guilt or innocence? I think we don't have that functional trust anymore. That just begs your question, what happened to it? But I think that's just, for me, a thought experiment that helps me think about the nature of the problem.
Hello, everyone. I'm Jenny Marie Jobo, coming from Newark, New Jersey. I work for the GEM Project, where we work with a lot of youth across different ages, 16 to 24. In particular, though, I'm working with youth around building policy. They've created policy at the school board level, because now they're allowed to vote as young as 16, specifically in Newark. And so a question I want to ask you, well, I actually have a couple questions, but we're going to do one. As both a historian and journalist, how do you think storytelling can help young people understand their role in shaping history and in their communities? Because oftentimes youth, particularly in urban settings, are like, I gotta go pick up my younger brother. I'm not worried about going to vote, right? And so that was my question.
Yeah, that's a great question too. And you know, I think that telling stories about people from the past and the efficacy of their work is really important. I mean, this is one of the reasons I believe the study of history is of tantamount importance, but we really need to have a democratic history so that we can see also, and not just sort of a history of successes. People have strived for a lot of things and not actually achieve them, but are still proud of having done that striving. So I think actually local history is the best way to do that, to think about what's gone on in your community. What have people tried to do? I know the American Historical Association had this initiative that I don't think actually went out, but they were going to suggest for the 250th that recommend to different K-12 age groups figuring out how your town or your neighborhood has over time celebrated the 4th of July, which I think is actually a really interesting assignment, because you go back into, it's fun to go find those things out, see what people did. You know, there's also all of the Black protest, which was Emancipation Day, the 5th of July, right? There's a whole world of storytelling that can be found in your very neighborhood, you know, about the 4th of July over the last 250 years that I think has the capacity to reveal just the scale and the stakes of the past.
Thank you.
Hi, Joaquin Sanchez, high school math teacher from Albuquerque, New Mexico. And I guess the question and the concern that I have is that I appreciate the history that you laid out, but part of the context, as I understand it, is that there's also a need to connect it with efforts that need to put constraints on our economic system too. I think Brandeis during the Depression said you can either have concentrated wealth or a functioning democracy. You can't have both. And so I guess what I want to know is where are those efforts that are combining this with putting real constraints on our economic system. And I'm not saying this as I think I am a socialist, not a communist. I believe what Arthur Oken said, who was in the LBJ administration, that the market has its place, but it has to be kept in its place. Public education should not be a market good, it should be a public good. So where's that piece coming together from your perspective?
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, you know, one of the great things about some of these projects in the 1930s was how truly pluralist they were about having that argument, right? What is the economic basis of our society? Is the the basis of our society consistent with a healthy democracy? Like, students could go listen to one of those debates with the communists and you know, the business owner or whatever in the 1930s and restage the debate in 2026. Like, that's a question to engage students with by giving them primary sources to think through the problem.
I'm Michael Quas from St. Ambrose Academy in Madison, Wisconsin, and I was wondering what lessons, if any, can we learn from the rise and fall of the Lyceum movement?
Yeah, you know, I think actually the Lyceum movement continues in another form on YouTube. I actually really think there's just so much going on TikTok and YouTube that is about tutorials, and it doesn't have the sense of communal gathering, although I think we maybe dismiss it too readily as a form of community.
Hi there, April Buckner, MICVA Challenge, Chief Program Officer. So I think my question had to do with one of the slides you put up where it says, is democracy in peril? And clearly that question has been asked for decade over decade. My question is very basic. Do you think democracy survives this moment? And if you do, in what iteration could that happen past the potential authoritarianism? But do you think that there is a way that democracy can be restructured and reformulated for a future that includes AI, unchecked capitalism?
Yeah, I do think the democratic crisis of legitimacy is real, and I think there's also a constitutional crisis of legitimacy that has to do with, there are a lot of constitutional theorists who say when a constitution can no longer be amended, it is de facto illegitimate. Like, people don't believe in it anymore if they are not the authors of it. If the premise of the Constitution is that we are the people who wrote it, and you know, we were talking earlier, like, a lot of Americans don't know you can revise the Constitution. They don't know you can revise the state constitution. A lot of Americans don't know they have a state constitution. But with the Educational Knowledge Project, they're beginning to learn. But, you know, like, I think there are real challenges there. But yeah, I do think we will right the ship.
Thank you.
Hi, nice to see you. Charlie Savinor, and I work for an organization called Civic Spirit. And we have the aspiration. I mean, we work with faith-based schools in the country, and there are 4 million actually learners who go to faith-based schools in America, which is about 10% of the country. Before I ask my question, I'm from Massachusetts, and I was so happy that you mentioned that the revolution began there and not in Philadelphia.
I know, it was a joint effort.
Yeah, of course. And also, go Patriots. Yes, we know the better team won. Thank you very much. But what I did, I just wanted to ask you, you mentioned, you know, the decline of civic messaging from unions and from, like, the YMCA and things like that. What do you think are the opportunities for faith-based schools at this moment in terms of imparting civic messaging to the country?
Do you have an answer for that? I don't have an answer. I don't know enough about faith-based. My kids went to public schools. I'm a public school kid. I feel like I don't have any.
I'm not going to steal your time, Jill. So.
Okay.
So it's great to ask a question that no one can answer, but I really appreciate your time.
No. It's a very important question. I suspect you're doing the things that, like, that's why you're here.
Yeah.
I wouldn't presume that I have any knowledge to offer. I think it's important when people say they don't know.
So let me ask you a question, if I can, just to so you can. It says, how do we overcome this idea of the separation of church and state rather than faith in the public square?
I think we have to have candid and open debate about it instead of retreating into our corners and sticking to ideological positions about it. I think it also merits a lot more historical inquiry than maybe public discourse has availed itself of. But thank you very much for that.
So we've got 2 last questions. So we are coming close to lunch. So we'll take these 2 questions.
Yeah, why don't you, ask them both and I'll answer
Exactly.
one.
Okay. Hi, I'm Eric Trin. I teach in West Philadelphia, Go Birds. And I was just wondering about, because you talked a lot about community and also civic engagement and how important community is. But I was wondering how us educators could empower different communities to build trust with each other, like especially since the educator might be from a different community. There also might be different communities that they may be teaching, and they also might not even understand fully, like, the middle school or high school kid community versus their adult brains, I guess.
Okay, thanks. And you want to just jump in here?
Scott Johnson, Battle Creek High School, Tennessee. I was just wondering, I kind of feel like we're headed towards some rough times as a nation. Financially, we're reaching the limits of what we can do. Globally, we have a position that we're probably not going to be able to hold on to forever. Would introducing direct democracy, like a lot of states have at the federal level to a certain extent with the technology we now have, be a way to kind of help glue the system together a little bit better so we can weather the storm? So.
Yeah, thank you. Thanks for both of those questions. And they relate in a certain way. In that I will just confess, I'm a big skeptic of digital democracy, like mass scaling tools to engage in kind of mass deliberation. I am a big believer in face-to-face encounters. This is why we have microphones in this room for this session, because I really like people to be able to speak in a room together. And I think that's also the answer to the community question of the first question. And I guess I just think it's worth taking a moment, like, to applaud yourselves, because these are things you accomplish every day, like crossing those divides, building those communities, sitting down with people, like recognizing that having these difficult conversations, and maybe they're about the church-state divide, or maybe they're about our economic conditions versus the nature of our democracy. This is actually the work that you all are doing every day. And I can just say, like, the final thing I would say, like, as a parent of public school kids who fairly recently finished high school, like, my greatest joys as a parent were often parent-teacher nights, not because, like, actually going to hear about my kids were horrible was not fun, but there's a kind of, like, 2 hours of wandering the hallways of your neighborhood public school, just seeing every other person in town who is there. They're out there to, like, meet the teachers. You can gab with them in the hallway, and you have a sense that you belong to a neighborhood, to a city, to a town, in a just truly visceral, meaningful, deep way. And to walk into those classrooms and see the commitment those teachers have made, I have never felt more a part of our democracy than on the wandering, exhausted hours from 7 to 9 p.m. of their teacher night. So that was just a way to say, like, I think you do, like, that is the work. And it is so appreciated, and I am so grateful for it, so thank you.
Say brava, Professor Lepore. Thank you so much. That was truly insightful. The answer to some of the questions I want to say is by bringing people together, as Professor Lepore said, in a room. Also, I think digitally one can support that. But in this room, we have educators who are from Catholic schools, educators from parochial schools, educators from charter schools, educators from traditional public schools. We have K through 5 educators, we have middle school educators, we have high school educators, we have higher ed educators. We are embarked together on what we could call a sort of universal civic learning journey and effort, building momentum. And the first step that's necessary is building relationships. This is a whole of society endeavor, renewing the tree of liberty through civic learning. We have a whole society endeavor. We can pull that off by building relationships. So I want to name that as the first step to overcoming some of those divides that make it feel as if one or another part of our community maybe doesn't have full access to public sphere. We can undo that and change that direction by building relationships. So I'm exceptionally grateful to all of you for being here. One quick poll before we go to lunch. On the apple pie question, I happen to be a pie maker. I want to see a show of hands, not quite right yet, I'll tell you when, as to whether or not you go with the plain apple pie, the apple pie with cheddar cheese, or the apple pie with vanilla ice cream. All right, plain apple pie eaters, raise your hands. Okay, maybe a quarter of the room. Apple pie with cheddar cheese. Well, that is building community there. Must be from Vermont. Where from? Florida is connecting to Vermont there. Thank you, Florida. All right, and then the apple pie with vanilla ice cream. I knew it. All right, it is lunchtime, folks. Go get your food, network with each other, make relationships over lunch, please.